"You'll never get a penny from us," Olivia whispered, loud enough for the whole table to hear. I was still holding the fork. I hadn't even finished the damn fish. And she stood there, smiling, while my retirement, our life's work, was already emptied behind my back. Then came the second blow, a court notice in the mail accusing me of mental incompetence. My own daughter was trying to erase me from my own life, legally. Everyone else? They clapped, nodded, pretended it was kindness. But Agnes and I planned for snakes like this. There's a safe deposit box they don't know about, and what's inside is going to flip everything. I may be old, but I'm not done. My name is Edward Whittaker, and I'm 75 years old. Each morning I follow the routines Agnes and I built over 50 years, brewing dark coffee, tending the roses she planted, and reviewing our business ledgers by the east window. Our modest home still carries Agnes's touch, her photographs on every wall, the lemon oil she used on the oak floors. My daughter Olivia, who once brought such joy, changed after marrying James Preston and his family money. Her visits became shorter, her hugs cooler, always rushing me to sign papers I should have read more carefully. Years ago, I slipped one final envelope into a safe deposit box, something Agnes called my belt and suspenders habit. That hidden document still warms me like an ember when I look at her wedding photo on the mantel. But let me start from the beginning. I'd always hated Olivia's modern townhouse. Too much glass, too many angles, like living inside a geometry problem. But she'd insisted on hosting my 75th birthday dinner there, and who was I to refuse my only daughter? You know those moments when something feels off, but you can't put your finger on it? That's how that evening started. The chandelier light was harsh, turning everyone's faces waxy and strange. The crystal glasses clinked too sharply against each other, like warnings I should have heeded. The dining room was filled with familiar faces, my old golf buddies from the club, neighbors I'd known for decades, even Frank Thompson, who'd helped me start my business back in '75. The table settings probably cost more than my first delivery truck. Funny how wealth can make everything look expensive, but nothing look comfortable. I remember the exact moment it happened. We'd just finished the main course, some fancy fish dish I couldn't pronounce, when Olivia stood up, champagne flute in hand. Her husband Dominic rose beside her, wearing that smirk I'd never trusted. The room got quiet, but not the good kind of quiet. More like the silence before a storm breaks. "Everyone?" Olivia began, her voice carrying that polished tone she'd picked up since marrying into money. "We're here to celebrate not just Dad's birthday, but also a new chapter in his life." She paused, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "James and I have been concerned about Dad's ability to manage his affairs as he ages, so for his safety and security, we've legally secured all his assets into our family trust." The four words hit me like a physical blow. My fingers went numb around my water glass as scattered applause broke out. Some guests even nodded, as if this violation was something to celebrate. Then Olivia locked eyes with me, and what I saw there wasn't my little girl anymore. "You'll never get a penny from us," she hissed, just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. The words carried the metallic taste of pennies in my mouth. I looked around the table, searching for what? Support, understanding. My golf partner Bill suddenly found his napkin fascinating. The Hendersons, my neighbors of 20 years, studied their plates like they held ancient mysteries. Even Frank Thompson, my oldest friend, couldn't meet my eyes. The waiter froze mid-pour, wine bottle suspended awkwardly over an empty glass before quietly backing away. You ever notice how shame feels hot and cold at the same time? That's what flooded through me as I pushed my chair back. The legs scraped against Olivia's precious hardwood floors. Agnes would have winced at the sound. "Thank you all for coming," I managed, amazed at how steady my voice sounded. "And thank you, Olivia, for this surprising announcement." I forced my lips into what must have been a grotesque approximation of a smile. "If you'll excuse me, I think I need some air." I walked out of that dining room with my spine straight, the way Agnes always insisted a man should carry himself. The night air hit me like a blessing, damp with coming rain and heavy with exhaust from the city traffic. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone, already planning to call my lawyer first thing in the morning. Whatever trap they'd sprung, whatever I'd signed without reading carefully enough, there had to be a way to unwind it. Standing there on the sidewalk, watching cars splash through puddles, I wondered how any signature could erase 50 years of work, how paper and ink could steal a man's life. My phone buzzed. A message from Olivia. "Don't make this messy." I stared at those 4 words until they blurred. The traffic light changed, casting alternating red and green shadows across the wet pavement. A taxi honked in the distance. The next morning I found myself in a strip mall law office where the fluorescent lights hummed like angry wasps. You know the kind of place. Worn carpet, fake plants in the corner, and a coffee maker that's seen better days. The secretary kept giving me sympathetic looks while I waited, like she'd seen this story before. Attorney Keller wasn't what I expected. Younger than my usual crowd, with sleeves rolled up and reading glasses perched on his head. He didn't waste time with small talk, just cleared space on a scratched conference table and started spreading out documents. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, shuffling through papers, "I've reviewed everything you sent over last night. I have to be straight with you. These trust instruments are ironclad." His fingers traced lines across the pages that seemed to whisper accusations with each turn. My throat felt like sandpaper. "Show me." He laid out 3 documents side by side. "Here, here, and here." His pen tapped against my initials, each one like a little betrayal. "These were signed during what your daughter called estate updates over the past few months." The dates brought it all back, Olivia rushing me through paperwork between her phone calls, saying things like, "It's just standard updates, Dad, and trust me, this protects both of us." The memory of her standing over my shoulder made my coffee turn sour in my stomach. "What about reversing it?" I asked. "There must be some way to—" Keller was already shaking his head. "See this section?" He highlighted a paragraph with his finger. "The trust is irrevocable. Once assets are transferred in, they can't be pulled back out without the trustee's approval," meaning your daughter and son-in-law. Remember how I mentioned Agnes loved her lemon oil polish? Sitting there, all I could smell was stale coffee and printer toner. Sometimes the absence of familiar comforts hits harder than any presence. "And my retirement accounts? If they were listed in the trust documents." He left the sentence hanging, but his expression said enough. I walked out clutching a manila folder full of copied documents that might as well have been blank for all the good they did me. The morning sun felt too bright, too cheerful for what I was about to do. The bank's kiosk was 3 stores down in the same strip mall. My fingers shook as I typed in my password. The screen blinked, numbers appeared, and for a moment I thought there must be some mistake. You ever had the wind knocked clean out of you? That's what those numbers did. My retirement account, the one Agnes and I had built over decades of careful saving, showed a balance of $172.43, not even enough for a week's groceries. The bus ride home was a blur of squealing brakes and muttered stops. I held that folder in my lap like it was full of broken glass, which in a way I suppose it was, started listing bills on the back of an envelope, utilities, insurance, groceries. The pen kept skidding off the paper because my hand wouldn't stay steady. The house. I had to protect the house. It was the last thing I had left. The only place where Agnes still lived in every corner and window frame. I could feel her presence strongest in the kitchen, where morning light would catch the copper-bottom pots she'd insisted on keeping polished. That's when my phone buzzed, a voicemail from the bank, all professional courtesy wrapped around words like delinquencies and property tax exposure. I played it twice, standing in my living room that suddenly felt smaller than it had that morning. I looked up at Agnes's photograph on the mantel, at her smile that always seemed to know more than she let on. The room that had felt like a sanctuary for 40 years now felt like it was closing in, shrinking with each bill I couldn't pay. The red notice was waiting in my mailbox like a stop sign. Property taxes, stamped "Final Warning" across the top, in letters that might as well have been carved into my chest. I stood there in the driveway, holding that paper while Mrs. Peterson next door waved from her garden. I managed a weak wave back, grateful she couldn't see how my hands were shaking. Inside, I spread the notice on the kitchen table, the same table where Agnes and I had shared breakfast for 40 years. The auction timeline made my fingertips go cold. 60 days. Just 60 days before they could put my home on the block. You know that feeling when bad news hits and your mind tries to run away from it? That's what I was fighting as I stared at Agnes's photos on the wall. There she was, smiling from our vacation in Yellowstone, from Olivia's college graduation, from our 40th anniversary dinner. Each memory felt like it was fading right in front of me, like old Polaroids left in the sun. The humiliation from the birthday dinner was still fresh, all those averted eyes, that cruel smile on Dominic's face. But now it was turning into something colder, something that sat in my gut like a block of ice. This wasn't just about pride anymore. This was about survival. I pulled out my records box. Agnes always teased me about keeping paper copies in a digital age. Better safe than sorry, I'd tell her, and she'd just shake her head and smile. The numbers didn't look any better on paper than they had at the bank's kiosk. Even if I sold my tools, good German-made ones that had built half the custom cabinets in town, it wouldn't make a dent. The bank's hold music was exactly what you'd expect. Tinny jazz that kept cutting out every 30 seconds to remind me how important my call was. 23 minutes later, I had an appointment for 9 a.m. the next morning. The woman on the phone said, "Payment plan options," in that careful way people talk about bad medicine. Looking around my living room, I started mentally pricing things out. The leather armchair where I used to read Olivia bedtime stories. The maple dining set Agnes had refinished herself. Even my old Chevy sitting in the garage, faithful as a dog but worth maybe $2,000 on a good day. Here's something they don't tell you about getting older. Pride and necessity start having long arguments in your head. I found myself looking up assisted living facilities on my ancient laptop, places with names like Sunset Gardens and Valley View Estates. Maybe it would be better than letting the neighbors watch me sell off pieces of my life piece by piece. I put the kettle on for chamomile tea, Agnes's remedy for troubled nights. But when I took a sip, it tasted like ashes in my mouth. The kettle's hiss reminded me of time running out, like a timer counting down to something I couldn't stop. Then, somewhere between the second and third cup, a memory surfaced. Agnes, sitting at this very table, insisting we keep originals of every contract we'd ever signed. "Paper doesn't lie," she'd say, carefully filing each document. And that letter, the one she'd written herself and had notarized just months before she left me. The memory flickered like a match in a dark room. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling when it hit me. There was still one thing Olivia couldn't touch. The words came out as barely a whisper in the darkness. Safe deposit box. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window screen. The hallway clock ticked past midnight, each click echoing in the quiet house. I listened to those sounds, the wind, the clock, the settling of old wood, and felt something I hadn't felt since opening that red notice. Hope. The thing about hope, though, is it doesn't let you sleep. So I lay there, remembering Agnes's voice. "Always keep something in reserve, Eddie. The world has teeth." The next morning, I was waiting at First Harbor Bank when they unlocked the doors at 9 sharp. You ever notice how banks always smell the same? Like money and furniture polish and other people's anxiety. My old leather wallet felt thick with the ID cards I'd brought. You can never be too careful these days. The index card in my pocket had the box number and access codes written in Agnes's neat handwriting. I'd found it exactly where she said it would be, tucked in her recipe box behind the banana bread instructions. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker," said Marie, the teller who'd known me since she was fresh out of high school. Now her own kids were in college. "Haven't seen you down in the vault for a while." My hands trembled slightly as I signed the access log. Funny how something as simple as writing your name can feel like defusing a bomb when there's enough riding on it. The vault corridor stretched ahead like something out of a spy movie, all gleaming metal and fluorescent lights. The carpet glue smell mixed with that distinct metallic scent you only get around that much steel. Marie's heels clicked against the floor as she led me to my box. "Take all the time you need," she said, turning her key while I used mine. That dual key system always reminded me of submarine launch protocols in old war films. The metal drawer slid out with a whisper. Inside, exactly where we'd left it, was the envelope marked Agnes Originals in her precise penmanship. The seal was still intact, yellowed with age but unbroken. For a moment I just stared at it, remembering the day we'd put it there. Agnes had been wearing her blue cardigan, the one with wooden buttons. My fingers didn't shake this time as I broke the seal. One by one I laid out the contents on the viewing table. Original contracts for the business, sale property titles with both our names clear as day, and there it was, Agnes's notarized letter. 8 pages of her careful handwriting, detailing our shared intentions for every asset we'd built together. You know that feeling when sensation returns to frozen fingers? That pins and needles warmth that means life's flowing back? That's what hope feels like when it's been gone too long. I was carefully sliding everything into the protective sleeves I'd brought when I heard footsteps behind me. The branch manager, Mr. Peterson, stood there with an expression I'd seen too many times lately, that careful blend of sympathy and professional distance. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, holding out a blue-backed legal document. "This was served to us yesterday afternoon. I'm afraid I'm required to inform you immediately." The court notice was printed on expensive paper, the kind law firms use to justify their billable hours. Olivia's petition for access hit me like a punch to the gut. The language was all clinical and proper. Concerns regarding cognitive capacity, duty to protect assets, risk of document destruction. My own daughter was telling a court I wasn't competent to manage my own papers. The hearing date was stamped in red, 30 days. 1 month to either prove my case or watch everything slip away for good. Peterson stood there waiting for some response, but what could I say? That my daughter was trying to erase me piece by piece, that she'd timed this perfectly, knowing the property tax deadline was breathing down my neck. I closed the drawer with steady hands. No point letting them see how much this rattled me. The ledger got my signature, just another line in a book full of other people's secrets. My mind was already building a list. Lawyer to call, documents to copy, witnesses to contact. I'd pin a calendar to the fridge tonight, mark off each day like a countdown. The vault door swung shut behind us with that distinctive boom, part thunder, part judgment. It echoed down the corridor like a judge's gavel, marking the start of something I never thought I'd face. A race against my own flesh and blood. I woke up to sunlight hitting the kitchen table where I'd spread everything out the night before. Lists, invoices, bank statements, they covered every inch like some desperate paper snowstorm. My coffee had gone cold, still half full from when I'd poured it at dawn. You ever notice how problems that seem manageable at midnight look twice as big in morning light? The landline's ring startled me. Nobody uses that number anymore except telemarketers and, well, old friends who never got around to programming cell phones. "Ed, it's Frank. Morrison." My hand tightened on the receiver. Frank and I went back 40 years to when we were both trying to get our businesses off the ground. He'd helped me negotiate my first major contract back when neither of us could afford proper lawyers. "Frank? Been a while. Too long. Listen, I'm bringing coffee. Real coffee. Not that dishwater you probably made 6 hours ago. We need to talk." Before I could protest, he'd hung up. That was Frank, direct as a punch to the nose. 20 minutes later, my doorbell rang. Frank looked exactly like he had at my retirement party 5 years ago, barrel-chested, white crew cut, expression that said he'd seen it all and wasn't impressed. He set 2 paper cups on the table and swept his eyes over my paper chaos. "This the trust mess?" I nodded. My throat felt tight. Funny how shame can sneak up on you even with old friends. "Stop that," Frank growled. "I can see you working yourself into a funk. Tell me about the box instead." "What box?" "The deposit box you mentioned years ago. The one Agnes insisted on." He took a long sip of coffee. "The one you're sitting on like it's made of nitroglycerin. Sometimes it takes an outside voice to snap you back to sense." I got up and retrieved the folder of documents I'd brought home from the bank. Frank watched as I laid each piece out under the morning light streaming through my kitchen window. "Original sale contract," I said, pointing. "Property deeds. Agnes's letter about our intentions for everything we built." Frank leaned forward, squinting at the contract. "Hold on." His finger traced down to the footer. "Page reference is wrong here. Should be 6 of 7, but it's marked 5 of 6. My heart did a funny skip. "What?" "Yeah, look, there's a gap in the section numbering too. There's supposed to be a page about the equipment transfer. Remember that mess with the die-cast machines?" The memory hit me like a splash of cold water. We'd spent weeks negotiating that section because the buyer tried to claim some equipment wasn't included in the sale. "I kept a copy," Frank said, tapping the table with his knuckles. "During that merger scare in '82, I copied everything. Military habits die hard. Always have a backup plan." Hope swelled in my chest, but uncertainty chased right behind it. "Frank, that's 40 years ago. You really think you still have it?" "Got the same filing cabinet in my garage. Everything's alphabetical by year." He stood up, leaving his coffee half finished. "Give me till tonight. I'll tear the place apart if I have to." I watched him leave, then turned to the documents spread across my table. With hands steadier than they'd been in days, I gathered everything and drove to the copy shop, made 3 sets, organized them in binders with labeled tabs. Back home, I drew a grid on paper, 30 squares for 30 days. 4 were already marked with red X's. The rest of the day crawled by like molasses in January. I checked my phone every 15 minutes, jumped at every car sound from the street. The sun was casting long shadows across my backyard roses when it finally rang. "Ed?" Frank's voice had an edge I couldn't read. "You might want to put on some coffee. I'm heading over." The next morning I was first in line when the bank opened, clutching a folder of documents that needed certified copying. The teller, Jenny according to her name tag, gave me a sympathetic smile as she examined each page. "These are important ones, Mr. Whitaker," she asked, carefully aligning the first sheet on the copier. "More than I can say." I watched. The green certification stamp marked each copy with official weight. The sound of that stamp hitting paper felt like ammunition being loaded. The courthouse was my next stop. The clerk's office smelled of old paper and coffee, and the fluorescent lights made everything look slightly unreal. I filed my response, making sure Agnes's letter was properly tagged as Exhibit A. The clerk's eyebrows went up slightly as she scanned it. "Strong language, here," she murmured, and I felt a flicker of pride. Agnes had always known exactly what she wanted to say. My phone buzzed while I was walking back to my car. Another text from Frank. "Found 3 more boxes. Dust bunnies breeding dust elephants up here." Attached was a photo of what looked like grey cotton candy coating stacks of folders. I'd barely made it home when a courier dropped off a letter from Olivia's lawyer. The envelope felt expensive, and the message inside was printed on paper so heavy it could have stopped bullets. My hands shook slightly as I read, "Be advised that pursuit of frivolous claims will result in sanctions." Frivolous. The word hit like a slap. 40 years of business, decades of careful record-keeping. Agnes's clear wishes, all dismissed as frivolous by someone who probably wasn't even born when I signed those original contracts. "You okay, Ed?" Frank's text came, with perfect timing. "Need another coffee run?" "I'm fine," I typed back. "How's the search?" "Bulb just died in the garage, fighting with my phone's flashlight app." The next few days blurred together. I marked off the calendar squares one by one until day 24 stared back at me. That's when Frank's message set my heart racing. "Found something. Get over here. Bring lunch." I grabbed sandwiches from the deli and drove to Frank's place, trying not to speed. His garage door was open, and I could see boxes and folders spread across his workbench. The same bench where we'd planned business strategies decades ago, its surface scarred by countless projects and midnight brainstorms. "Behind the lawn edger," Frank said by way of greeting. Some genius, probably me, labeled it Tax Stuff 82 instead of Contracts. He lifted a banker's box onto the bench, sending up a small cloud of dust. I set the sandwiches aside, forgotten, as Frank carefully extracted a yellowed page. Even before he set it under his shop lamp, I recognized the layout. "Equipment Transfer Addendum," he said quietly, "complete with vendor stamp. Dates clear as day, 2 months before any trust nonsense started." My pulse skittered as I leaned in closer. There were the signature blocks, exactly where they should be. And there, catching the light like a beacon, was the notary stamp. "Hold it steady," I said, hands trembling slightly as I took photos with my phone. "Let me get the stamp in better light." Frank adjusted the lamp. "Want me to find a sleeve for it?" I nodded, already setting 2 alarms on my phone for morning filing. We sealed the page in a fresh protective sleeve, handling it like the treasure it was. A gust of wind rattled the shop door, sending a swirl of dust through the lamp's beam. I stared at the page in my hands, wondering if it would be enough, if a 40-year-old document could really turn the tide. "You're thinking too hard," Frank said, finally unwrapping his sandwich. "Eat something. We'll deal with tomorrow when it gets here." The shop lamp cast long shadows across the workbench as evening settled in, and dust motes danced in its beam like memories stirred up from long rest. I got to the clerk's office 15 minutes before. They opened, the keystone page safely enclosed in a reinforced envelope. My hands were steady now. Funny how clarity can do that to you. A young clerk with kind eyes processed the filing, and I made sure to get extra certified copies. You learn in business to always have backups of your backups. Need to get these to opposing counsel? She asked, and I nodded. Their office is just 3 blocks east. The law firm occupied half a floor in one of those glass towers that always reminded me of giant mirrors. The reception area had leather chairs that probably cost more than my first delivery truck. I handed the courtesy copies to a receptionist who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. 10 minutes later, Olivia's lawyer sauntered out, all-expensive suit and practiced smile. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, flipping through the pages with manicured fingers. "More creative narratives from a confused senior?" His smirk made my jaw tighten. "The signatures speak for themselves," I replied, keeping my voice level. Agnes always said dignity was the best answer to arrogance. By 2 o'clock, I was sitting in courtroom 2B, breathing in that distinct mix of wood polish and tension that all courtrooms seem to share. Remember those old westerns where everyone's watching the gunfighters size each other up? It felt a bit like that. Judge Ramirez entered, a compact woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper manner. She had the kind of presence that made everyone sit straighter. I noticed she read while people talked, really read, not just skimmed. "These signature dates," she said, tapping the keystone page, "predate any trust transfer by 2 years. My collar felt damp as Attorney Keller stood. "Yes, Your Honor. Furthermore, Mrs. Whitaker's notarized letter explicitly states fabrications," Olivia's lawyer cut in, his hands flying up like startled birds. "These convenient discoveries show nothing but confusion and—" "Counsel," Judge Ramirez's word cracked like a whip. "I'm more interested in chain of custody." She turned those keen eyes toward me. "Where has this document been for 40 years? I glanced at Frank in the gallery as Keller explained about merger protocols and backup files. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Dominic leaning close to Olivia, whispering something that made her lips thin into a hard line. "Your Honor," Keller continued, "we have a witness who can speak to document retention practices from that period." Frank took the stand, looking more comfortable than I expected. Maybe it was all those years of giving quotes to trade magazines, but he handled their questions like a pro. "Yes, Your Honor. It was standard procedure during potential mergers," he explained. "Keep originals of everything, especially equipment transfers. Too many deals went south over missing paperwork." The gallery's murmur rose slightly. I saw a few heads nodding, other business owners probably. They knew how paperwork could save or sink you. Judge Ramirez held up her hand for quiet. "I'll need briefs on admissibility by 9 tomorrow morning." She fixed both lawyers with a stern look. "Focus on chain of custody and authentication standards for pre-digital records." My legal pad was covered in underlined words and circled dates. I'd written signatures 3 times, each time pressing harder with the pen. The judge's gavel cracked, and everyone stood as she left. The hallway outside smelled like furniture polish and old paper files. I was checking my watch. Frank had offered to buy lunch, when I heard Olivia's heels on the marble floor. She brushed past me, close enough that I caught a whiff of her expensive perfume. "You won't survive discovery," she whispered, her voice cold as January wind. I just gripped Agnes's letter tighter in my pocket. The paper felt warm, almost alive, like it held all the truth we'd need. Frank appeared at my elbow. "Ready for that lunch?" But before I could answer, Keller caught my eye and motioned me over to discuss tomorrow's brief. That night turned into a marathon of paperwork and coffee. Attorney Keller's office stayed open late, the fluorescent lights making everything feel slightly unreal. We spread documents across his conference table like we were planning a military campaign. "Details matter here," Keller said, tapping the notary seal with his pen. "Every date, every signature block needs to be crystal clear." He had his sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, not the usual polished look you'd expect from a lawyer. I'd seen that kind of focus before back when Agnes and I were building the business. She'd sit at our kitchen table with the books spread out, checking every invoice twice. "Trust the numbers," she'd say. "They don't lie like people do." Frank showed up around 8 with takeout containers and his reading glasses. "Time to trim the fat," he announced, pulling up a chair. He went through my declaration line by line, red pen in hand, like a surgeon with a scalpel. Any time I got too emotional or wandered off track, he'd slash through the words. "Keep it clean," he muttered, "like a maintenance report. What happened, when it happened, how you can prove it." The rain started sometime after 10. a soft patter against the windows that made everything feel more urgent somehow. We worked through certified copies, arranged photo exhibits of the notary seals, and built a timeline that could stand up to scrutiny. Morning came too soon. The courthouse steps were slick with drizzle, and my shoes made squeaking sounds on the marble floors. Judge Ramirez walked in carrying a stack of filings that looked thick enough to stop bullets. The courtroom felt different this time, tenser, like everyone knew we'd reached a tipping point. Olivia sat with her legal team, looking fresh and polished while I felt wrung out. But Agnes used to say appearances were just gift wrap. It's what's inside the package that counts. Judge Ramirez didn't waste time. She laid out our filings and Olivia's objections side by side, reading selected passages aloud in that clear, sharp voice of hers. When she looked up, her eyes were focused and certain. "The court finds sufficient foundation for these documents," she announced. "The chain of custody is clear, the dates are independently corroborated, and the notary seals are consistent with records from that period." She paused, looking directly at both legal teams. "We'll proceed with full evidentiary hearing tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Beside me, Keller nodded slightly. One small battle won, but the war was far from over. Watching Olivia's legal team pack up their briefcases, I could practically see the gears turning. They had that look, the one that said they were ready to burn everything down just to win. Sometimes I still couldn't believe my daughter had become someone who'd hire people like that. Back home, I turned my dining room into a war room. Every exhibit had its place, every document sleeve labeled and cross-referenced. I lined up the binders like soldiers, checking and rechecking the tabs until they were perfectly aligned. It was the kind of methodical work that usually calms the mind, like when I used to inventory the warehouse at year's end. "Just tell the truth," Agnes would say, whenever I had to speak at trade shows. "The truth has its own power." So I practiced my testimony out loud, walking through the empty house, repeating the phrases from her notarized letter until they felt as natural as breathing. The rain picked up as midnight approached. I stood at the window, watching it fall through the streetlights, listening to the steady hum of the refrigerator, the only other sound in the house besides my own breathing, and the gentle tick of Agnes's favorite clock. Before heading to bed, I walked over to her photograph, the one from our first vacation after the business turned its first real profit. Her smile still made everything feel possible. That's when I heard it, the sound of tires on wet, pavement slowing to a stop, a car idling at the curb outside my house. I killed the lights and stood in the darkness, listening to the rain and the engine's low purr. I've testified in court before, zoning hearings, permit reviews, that sort of thing. But this morning felt different. The ceiling fans chopped shadows across Judge Ramirez's bench while I made my way to the stand, and every footstep seemed to echo. You know that moment when you're about to start a crucial presentation and your mouth goes dry. That's how it felt when I raised my right hand. But then I caught sight of Agnes's wedding band on my finger, still there after all these years, and somehow that steadied me. Attorney Keller took me through the documents step by step, his questions as precise as a machinist's measurements. We started with the original business formation papers, then moved through vendor, contracts, property deeds, and bank records. Each date landed with a solid click, like tumblers falling into place in a lock. "And this notarized letter," Keller said, nodding to the clerk. "Can you identify it?" The projector hummed, and suddenly Agnes's handwriting filled the screen. I'd forgotten how distinctive her penmanship was, those graceful loops in her capital letters, the way she'd press a little harder on important words. Seeing it, projected large like that, it was almost like hearing her voice again. "That's Agnes's letter," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "She wrote it the same day we updated our wills, insisted on having it notarized right there in the bank." Olivia's lawyer shot up. "Objection, hearsay and—" "Your Honor," Keller cut in smoothly. "This goes to intent and contemporaneous documentation of ownership. The notary seal and date are clearly visible." Judge Ramirez studied the projection. "Overruled. Continue." Olivia's lawyer tried a different angle, something about custodial chain and authentication, but the judge shut that down too. I could see Olivia's face getting tighter with each overruled objection. Frank took the stand next. He'd put on his good suit, the one he saves for veterans' events, and his voice carried that same no-nonsense tone from our Army days. Standard practice back then was to keep duplicate copies of critical vendor contracts, he explained, pointing to specific paragraphs. Especially during the merger discussions in '82, too many companies were getting squeezed out by surprise paperwork. The judge leaned forward, comparing dates on the vendor stamp against the notary seal on Agnes's letter. Both were months before any trust transfer. Both were clean as a whistle. I watched her eyes move between documents, checking, rechecking. The whole courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Even the ceiling fans felt quieter. When Judge Ramirez finally looked up, her expression was granite firm. The court finds the original contracts and Mrs. Whitaker's notarized declaration controlling in this matter. She turned slightly toward Olivia's legal team. The trust's claim fails for lack of standing. These assets were never legitimately transferred. My fingers went white around the witness stand rail. Across the room, Dominic muttered something that would have started a fight in any other setting. "Clerk," Judge Ramirez continued, "prepare orders restoring title and account access to Mr. Whitaker. All current trust restrictions are hereby dissolved." The gallery let out a collective breath, like a tire finally releasing its pressure. I stayed perfectly still, the way you do when you're not quite sure if the danger's really passed. That's when I caught snippets of whispers behind me. Something about forged signatures on the earlier trust filings. The murmurs spread like smoke under a door, and I watched Olivia's lawyer's face change color. But right then all I could think about was Agnes's letter up on that screen, her signature as bold and clear as the day she wrote it. She'd always said doing things right the first time saves you from having to explain yourself later. The judge was still talking, laying out next steps and schedules, but my mind had locked onto that one simple fact. Agnes's careful planning had just saved everything we'd built together. Ever notice how numbers on a bank statement can make your whole world shift? I sure did that afternoon, sitting across from Ms. Chen, the recovery officer at First Harbor. She had a stack of forms nearly an inch thick, but her smile was genuine. "The court order's been processed, Mr. Whitaker. Let's get your access restored." Her fingers moved across the keyboard with quiet efficiency. "Would you like to review your current balances?" The statement she handed me felt different from the ones I'd been dreading these past weeks. These numbers didn't mock, they steadied. My retirement account was back, just as Agnes and I had left it. The property tax fund sat untouched, ready for its purpose. "I'd like to schedule that tax payment immediately," I said, and the relief in my voice surprised even me. "Of course." She pulled up the county portal. "We can process that right now." While Ms. Chen worked, my phone buzzed with updates from Attorney Keller. He was forwarding the court order everywhere it needed to go. Property registries, investment firms, even that old vendor network we'd built the business on. Each message felt like another brick being set back into place. "Just need your signature here, here, and here," Ms. Chen said, sliding papers across her desk. The pen felt solid in my hand. Nothing like those rushed signatures Olivia had pushed for months ago. I took my time, made each one count. Walking out of the bank, I caught a glimpse of the evening news playing in the lobby. There was Olivia's company logo, but the ticker underneath wasn't kind. Questions arise over forged signatures in trust dispute. My phone had started lighting up with unfamiliar numbers, reporters, I figured, hunting their next story. But they weren't just calling me. From what Keller messaged, Olivia and Dominic's phones were ringing too. Only they were getting calls from creditors, people worried about all those fancy investments they'd leveraged with secured assets that weren't so secure anymore. You know that moment when the sun's just about gone and the streetlights haven't quite taken over? That's when I walked home, keys cutting into my palm like they wanted to remind me they were real. The house stood exactly as I'd left it that morning, but something had shifted. Maybe it was me. The door opened to that familiar mix of dust and lemon oil, Agnes's cleaning routine that I'd kept up all these years. I hung my jacket, set the paid tax receipt next to her wedding photo, and felt something strange in my chest. Where there used to be this burning anger, this need to make things right, there was just space. Empty space. I'd won. Everything was back where it belonged. So why did victory taste so hollow? The window seat where Agnes used to read caught the last bit of daylight. I could almost see her there, bifocals catching the light as she worked through her crossword puzzle. But the chair sat empty, and all the court orders in the world couldn't fill it again. My phone lit up once more. Keller this time. Perjury referral filed. Consequences inbound. The kettle clicked in the kitchen, a sound so normal it almost made me laugh. I'd put it on without thinking, pure habit. Across the street, porch lights started flicking on, neighbors settling in for the evening. Through my window, their warm glow looked like stars coming out one by one. I poured hot water over a chamomile tea bag, Agnes's favorite for evening quiet. The steam rose up, carrying that sweet, familiar scent, and for just a moment, I could hear her voice. Justice doesn't need an audience, Edward. It just needs to be done right. The paid tax receipt caught my eye again, official stamp clear as day. At least that part was settled. No more threats of auction, no more letters, stamped in red. The house would stay the home we'd made it. The morning news hit like a thunderclap over coffee. There was Olivia's face on my tablet screen, not in some society page this time, but under headlines about forgery investigations and allegations of systematic fraud. Ever see a house of cards collapse? It's not dramatic like an explosion. It's more like watching dominoes tip in slow motion. Luxury retailer freezes credit lines, one headline read. Another, high-end development group calls in secured notes. The stories painted a picture of Dominic and Olivia's carefully stacked world tumbling down, one credit line at a time. You'd think I'd feel some kind of satisfaction. Instead, I just felt tired. The kind of tired that seeps into your bones and makes every movement feel like you're walking through deep water. Frank showed up around 11, same as he had most days since this whole mess started. "Come on," he said, jingling his car keys. "Market's open." The farmer's market smelled like fresh bread and early summer. We walked past stands of bright vegetables, Frank carrying a paper bag of rolls from the German baker, while I picked out tomatoes that reminded me of Agnes's garden. "These'll be good for lunch," I said, testing their ripeness. Agnes always said store tomatoes were just red disappointments. Frank chuckled, but his eyes stayed serious. "How you holding up, Ed, really?" I set down a tomato that suddenly felt too heavy in my hand. You know that feeling when you've won the fight but can barely lift your arms to celebrate? He nodded, waiting for more. "That's where I am," I admitted. "Everything's back where it should be, but I'm just done. Maybe that's what Olivia wanted all along, to wear me down until I didn't care anymore." Frank shifted the bag of rolls to his other arm. "Surviving isn't the same as living, Ed. You taught me that after Sarah passed. The memory hit me like a warm breeze. I'd said those words to Frank 5 years ago, after he lost his wife. Funny how wisdom comes back around. Back home I found myself moving with purpose for the first time in days. The curtains Agnes had picked out needed rehanging. They'd been crooked since this whole mess began. The front door hinge had developed a squeak that would have driven her crazy. Little things, but they mattered. In the study, I spread out the documents that had saved everything. Some deserved more than just plastic sleeves in a binder. I picked out frames that would protect without hiding the signatures, the dates, the stamps that proved truth could still matter. My email pinged with updates from the county clerk's office, restoration orders for property titles, each one stamped and certified. I filed the confirmations in a fresh binder labeled Agnes Kept in my steadiest handwriting. Every attached document that opened felt like another small lock clicking back into place. The afternoon light was turning gold when another email arrived. Notice of withdrawal foreclosure action. Below that, confirmation that all property liens had been satisfied and cleared. You'd think news like that would hit like a firework, but it settled over me like a quiet snowfall instead. A courier van pulled up outside just as the sunset started painting the living room walls. The delivery needed a signature, certified copies of the final court orders bound in blue covers with gold seals catching the light. Standing at the mantel, I shifted things around. Agnes's wedding photo needed to stay central. That was non-negotiable. The framed letter, she'd written the one that saved everything, would go on the right, but I left a space on the left, just enough room for one more thing. Frank's words from the market echoed as I adjusted the frames. Surviving isn't the same as living. He was right, of course. And somehow in all this rearranging and restoring, I was starting to feel the difference. The weight of consequences. Have you ever watched someone's carefully constructed facade crack and crumble? Not in one dramatic moment, but piece by quiet piece. That's what happened to Olivia and Dominic over the next few days. Each morning brought new headlines, each one another chip in their polished veneer. My phone buzzed with a text from Attorney Keller. DA's office just announced charges, multiple counts of perjury, filing forged instruments, looking at serious time if convicted. I set the phone down and stared out the window. The roses Agnes had planted needed pruning, their branches reaching wild in the morning light. Like everything else lately, they reminded me of balance, how nature and consequences both find their way. Channel 4 wants an interview, Frank told me over coffee later that morning. So does the Business Journal. I shook my head. Let the courts do the talking. The financial fallout hit like dominoes. First, their country clubs suspended their membership pending resolution of certain matters. Then their luxury car leases got accelerated. Seems the finance company had concerns about creditworthiness. I heard through Frank that moving trucks showed up at their townhouse to repossess furniture they'd financed through some exclusive design house. Their whole life was leverage, Frank said, watching me write out the property tax check. House of cards built on other people's money. The check felt solid in my hand. $12,847.33 to clear everything, including penalties. Not a small sum, but it was mine to pay, fair and square. I drove it to the county office myself, waited in line like everyone else. The clerk's stamp echoed like a judge's gavel. Paid in full. Back home, I pulled out Agnes's old cleaning supplies. The lemon oil still lived under the kitchen sink, right where she'd always kept it. The wood furniture drank it up, like they'd missed her touch too. You know that feeling when a house starts breathing again, when the walls stop holding their breath? That's what happened as I worked my way through each room, opening blinds, straightening pictures, letting light touch corners that had been hiding too long. In the study, I gathered the court orders, title restorations, and Agnes's letter, all the papers that had turned the tide. Together, they told a story of truth outlasting lies, of patience beating greed. The frame I'd chosen was simple oak, nothing fancy. Agnes would have approved. The afternoon sun slanted through the front windows as I lifted her wedding photo from the mantel. She was looking at the camera with that slight smile of hers, the one that said she knew more than she was saying. The same smile she'd worn when she insisted we keep original copies of everything. You were right all along, I told her picture, setting it next to the framed documents. The glass caught the light just so, making both frame and photo glow like they shared the same spirit, because they did, really. Both were proof of the same truth. Outside, Mr. Peterson's lawnmower started up, and Mrs. Chen's wind chimes tinkled in the breeze. Normal sounds, everyday sounds. The neighborhood settling back into its rhythm like nothing had ever disrupted it. I stood back and studied the mantel. Everything balanced now. Agnes's photo, the documents that saved us, even the brass clock she'd inherited from her father. All the pieces finding their proper place again. You know how some victories need to be shouted, while others work better as quiet lessons. This was the quiet kind, the kind that older men understand in their bones, that real pride isn't about noise, it's about structure, about building. Things that last. I rested my fingertips on the edge of the frame, feeling the smooth oak beneath them. Agnes would have wanted me to say something here, something that caught the lesson without gloating, something earned through experience rather than anger. Looking straight ahead, seeing my reflection ghost-like in the glass, I spoke the words that felt as true as sunrise. Greed always buries itself deeper than it digs. The late afternoon. Light caught both frames, making Agnes's smile and her signature shine as one truth, one testimony. One final proof that what's built on solid ground outlasts what's built on shifting sand.